Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really trying to get behind a major global event, something that might seem straightforward, but, well, it really isn't. We're focusing on Afghanistan.
Indeed. A situation with layers upon layers of complexity.
Exactly. We're diving into this dramatic shift involving Afghanistan specifically, a huge diplomatic move by Russia, and how that connects to the, frankly, devastating humanitarian crisis still ongoing there. The key date we're looking at is July 3rd, 2025.
A very significant date in this context.
So the big question for us today is, how do we make sense of Russia's motivations for recognizing the Taliban? And, maybe more importantly, what does this mean for the millions of people in Afghanistan caught in this severe humanitarian crisis? Our goal here is to sort of untangle this web, the security stuff, the economic angles, the geopolitical games that shape how countries deal with the Taliban, but without losing sight of the human cost.
Absolutely. It's crucial to look beyond just the headlines, connect those big diplomatic moves to what's actually happening on the ground. That's what we'll aim for.
Okay, let's get into it then. The big news. July 3rd, 2025. Russia officially recognizes the Taliban-run Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. What makes this single act so significant?
Well, the significance really comes down to Russia being the first UN member state to grant formal diplomatic recognition since the Taliban took power back in August 2021.
The first one, wow.
Exactly. And crucially, this wasn't a sudden decision. It was really the final step in a long, steady process of normalization that Moscow had been pursuing.
Right. It sounds like there was quite a bit of groundwork laid, not just an overnight thing. Can you walk us through some of those key steps? What led up to this moment?
Sure. I think the most critical step, the real linchpin, was Russia's Supreme Court officially removing the Taliban from its list of terrorist organizations. That happened on April 17th, 2025.
The legal change. That makes sense.
Precisely. And that legal move itself was only possible because of amendments made to Russia's federal law on countering terrorism back in May 2024. These were changes endorsed personally by President Putin.
So Putin was directly involved in enabling this shift.
It appears so. And even before that, there were subtle signs. Russian state media, for instance, had reportedly been instructed not to refer to the Taliban as a banned terrorist organization anymore. So this legal shift really just formalized what was already happening and paved the way for the July 3rd recognition.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting for me. Why Russia? Why would they be the first? Especially given, their pretty complicated history with the Taliban. What are the real drivers behind this decision?
Yeah, that's the core question, isn't it? If we zoom out a bit, Russia's decision seems driven by a mix of things. Pragmatic calculations, mostly. We're talking regional security, economic interests, and, of course, broader geopolitical strategy.
Okay, break that down for us. Let's start with security.
All right. First, security concerns. Russia increasingly sees the Taliban, perhaps pragmatically, as a potential partner in fighting ISIS-K, the Islamic State, in Khorasan Province.
ISIS-K, right. That's been a major threat in the region.
A huge threat, especially near Russia's borders with Central Asia. Putin himself, back in July 2024, actually called the Taliban allies in the fight against terrorism, specifically against ISIS-K.
Allies. That's a strong word, considering the history.
It really is. It shows a significant shift in Moscow's thinking, especially since ISIS-K became prominent around 2014. It seems like a calculation maybe viewing the Taliban as the lesser of two evils, if you will, to help stabilize their southern flank.
Okay, so stability nearby is key. But is it just about defense? Are there, positive gains they're hoping for? Economic ones, maybe?
Absolutely. That's the second major piece, economic opportunities. Afghanistan, even under the Taliban, has shown interest since 2022 in buying Russian oil and wheat. They're desperate economically.
Which Russia presumably has available, especially with sanctions elsewhere?
Exactly. And the Taliban has also been inviting Russian companies to invest particularly in Afghanistan's mineral resources, mining, but also infrastructure energy projects. Removing that terrorist label, well, it just makes all of that cooperation much, much easier.
Smooth the path for business deals.
Precisely. And Russia was quick off the mark here. They were actually the first country to open a business representative office in Kabul after the Taliban takeover in 2021. So they were laying this economic groundwork early on.
Interesting. So security, economics. What about the bigger picture? Russia's place in the world.
That's the third element, regional influence and geopolitics. Russia wants to foster dialogue, build regional security cooperation, especially since countries like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, neighbors to Afghanistan, have already established their own sort of pragmatic working relationships with the Taliban.
Driven by their own needs, I saw.
By their own security and economic needs, yes. So Russia is looking to integrate Afghanistan into these new regional security setups, but critically, setups that exclude Western influence.
Filling the vacuum left by the U.S. withdrawal.
That's a big part of it. This move fits neatly into Russia's broader strategy of, challenging Western-led norms, promoting a multipolar world order. And often that involves working with non-Western regimes, sometimes controversial ones. It's about asserting influence where they see an opening.
So putting it all together, it's a strategic play. Stabilize the neighborhood, grab economic benefits, and push back against Western influence, particularly post-U.S. withdrawal. It really is a complete turnaround from their past position, isn't it?
It absolutely is. A major strategic recalculation. You have to remember, Russia backed the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance in the 90s. They actively fought against them.
Yeah.
And they formally blacklisted the Taliban as terrorists in 2003, partly because they were worried about Taliban support for separatists in Russia's own North Caucasus region. So this July 3rd recognition, it's a truly pivotal moment. It signals Moscow's pragmatic, perhaps reluctant acceptance of the reality on the ground now.
Okay, but Russia's move really stands out because, well, most of the rest of the world hasn't followed suit, right? What does this actually mean for the Taliban internationally? How have other countries reacted?
That's the crux of it. Despite Russia's big step, the Taliban government remains largely isolated internationally. The vast majority of the world community has held back formal recognition.
And the main reason is?
It overwhelmingly comes down to human rights concerns, especially the severe restrictions on women and girls' education, work, public life, and also the Taliban's failure, really, to form any kind of inclusive government that represents diverse Afghan groups.
So the UN, for example, what's their official stance?
The UN still doesn't recognize the Taliban government. Officially, they continue to recognize the previous Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. There was even a UN General Assembly resolution in November 2022 that condemned the Taliban government and explicitly urged countries not to recognize them.
Wow.
And it gets starker. Afghanistan actually lost its UN voting rights temporarily in May 2024.
Wow.
Why? Unpaid membership fees. That really highlights their isolation.
Okay, so the UN position is clear. What about major Western powers? The US, UK, Canada.
Pretty much unanimous opposition to recognition there. Canada, Australia, France, the UK, the US. They've all explicitly said they won't recognize the Taliban government. They cite the human rights situation, the way the Taliban took power. The U.S. position has been consistent. No recognition for any government that harbors terrorists or doesn't uphold basic human rights.
But is it a complete freeze-out?
Yeah.
Or is there some level of interaction happening?
That's a key distinction. No formal recognition doesn't mean zero contact. It's more nuanced. Several countries are engaging with the Taliban, even without recognizing them officially.
Like who?
China is a prime example. They were actually the first country to formally accept the credentials of a Taliban-appointed ambassador back in January 2024.
Interesting. So accepting an ambassador isn't the same as full recognition?
Not quite. It's a step below, but significant. The UAE and Turkmenistan have also accepted credentials from Taliban diplomats, and Qatar, of course, has been the main diplomatic hub for the Taliban since way back in 2012.
And why are these countries engaging? What's their motivation?
Usually, it boils down to specific national interests. Security concerns are big, especially for neighbors. Economic opportunities, think of China's oil extraction deal signed in 2023, or sometimes just wanting regional stability. It's this kind of pragmatic, almost transactional engagement.
So we see this clear split. Formal recognition is very rare, mostly just Russia now.
Right.
But below that, there's this layer of pragmatic contact based on self-interest. It really shows that tension, doesn't it? Balancing human rights principles versus dealing with the people actually in charge.
Exactly that tension.
Okay, while all this diplomacy, or lack thereof, is happening, the situation for ordinary people in Afghanistan. Let's shift focus there. The sources paint a really grim picture. How bad is the humanitarian reality right now?
It's hard to overstate, honestly. Afghanistan is deep in a severe humanitarian crisis in 2025. We're talking about almost half the population, that's nearly 23 million people out of 46 million, needing humanitarian aid just to survive.
Half the population, just staggering numbers.
They are. And it's crucial to understand this isn't just about drought or earthquakes, though those happen too. A major driver is the Taliban's own policies, the sustained restrictions, especially on rights.
Particularly for women and girls.
Exactly. They limit access to basic services, to jobs, to livelihoods. Women are largely barred from most employment, from public spaces. Girls are banned from school beyond the 6th grade. This systematic discrimination just deepens inequality and pushes millions into desperate need year after year. It's a compounding crisis.
So internal policies are actively making the humanitarian crisis worse. What about the economy and the aid response?
Well, the economy is extremely fragile, and a huge problem in 2025 has been cuts in donor funding. This has severely hit essential services, basic things like hospitals. The Marvez Regional Hospital in Kandahar was mentioned as struggling.
Less money means fewer services.
Directly. The UN Deputy Relief Chief actually warned the Security Council about this in June 2025, saying these cuts are crippling the humanitarian response. Hunger is still incredibly widespread, about 14.8 million people facing acute food insecurity earlier this year. That includes millions of young children and women needing nutrition support.
And the funding needed versus what's actually coming in.
That's perhaps the most shocking figure. The UN and its partners estimate they need about US $2.42 billion for 2025 to reach the most vulnerable 16.8 million people.
Okay.
But as of recent reports, the funding level was at just 3.5%.
3.5%.
Yes, leaving a funding gap of about US $2.41 billion. It's enormous. Major donors like the US and UK have given money, but it's clearly nowhere near enough.
Unbelievable gap.
And on top of the money shortage, actually delivering the aid is getting harder. There was a big spike in reported access incidents problems getting aid through in May 2025, a 63% increase. So it's a perfect storm of need, underfunding, and operational roadblocks.
It's just devastating. The political isolation, the internal policies, the funding cuts, all directly making the suffering worse. It doesn't sound like Russia's recognition changes much on that front immediately.
Not directly on the humanitarian aid front, no. But connecting it back to the bigger picture, Russia's move could have longer-term implications. It definitely gives the Taliban a legitimacy boost, even if it's just from one major power.
And that might encourage others.
It could, particularly maybe countries in Central Asia that already have those pragmatic ties. It might nudge them towards deeper engagement, perhaps even recognition down the line, though that remains to be seen.
And geopolitically, this could, as you said, reshape the region. More rivalry for influence in Afghanistan now that the U.S. isn't the dominant player, maybe pulling Afghanistan into security arrangements that exclude the West.
That's certainly a potential outcome, yes. However, there's a strong counterargument, the critical perspective. Many fear that legitimizing the Taliban without concrete changes on human rights, well, it risks just enabling the ongoing repression and bad governance.
Which could lead to more instability, ironically.
Well, exactly, that's the fear.
Yeah.
So that central tension remains. Pragmatic engagement for security or economics versus holding the line on human rights principles. And the Taliban's unwillingness to form an inclusive government is still a massive roadblock for almost everyone else.
So wrapping this up, what's the key takeaway for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this? It really seems to be about looking past the headlines, doesn't it? Seeing how national interests, history, and this terrible human crisis all weave together.
I think that's right. Afghanistan is such a stark reminder of how big geopolitical shifts and internal government choices have profound, direct impacts on millions of ordinary lives. It forces us to confront those really difficult choices countries face between practical needs and fundamental principles.
And it shows that even with so much information flying around, taking the time to really unpack these complex situations like we tried to do today gives you a much clearer, more informed perspective than just catching the news alerts.
Hopefully, yes.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. With Russia now offering formal recognition and the humanitarian needs being so incredibly dire, how might this pressure other countries? Can we see a shift away from just condemnation towards more, maybe uncomfortable engagement, even with those human rights concerns still very much on the table? Something to think about.